Hello everybody, Goblin Squire here. Welcome to my first video tutorial. It'll be a little bit trial and error this first time I think, so do give me any feedback you have, but hopefully this will be something helpful for you. So today I'm going to talk about removing excess material, mould lines, flashing, things like that from your miniatures in preparation before painting. So I've got some tools here that I use and some miniatures that I will show you as well from a number of different manufacturers and in some different materials. So we'll have a look at all of them and see where it ends up, and then if you have any questions or anything like that at the end, do let me know. So I'm going to look at tools first of all. And I've got these three in front of me here, and each of these are used for different things really in the removal process. As you might expect, these clippers here are good for really removing things from sprues. So I mean, if you see, this is actually a very old Games Workshop miniature, but where you're looking to remove it from a sprue, these are very useful. Where you need a lot of detail, the knife might be a little better, but where you're doing that, make sure that you're a little bit away from where the excess material actually touches the miniature, because you don't want to lose any detail, and you can use these later on to look at that. But so these are called vents. I think they have different names, but this is where the material is poured into the mold, and also it obviously keeps it in place when it's there. So these tools are useful for those kind of bigger jobs where you might have a large chunk of something sticking out. One thing I would say at this point is I would resist the urge to pay vast amounts of money for some of the own brand stuff. Games Workshop, as do a number of manufacturers, makes a number of different tools. Some of them are very good. I think I've recently shown you that I have some of their paint handles, which are very good. I like them very much, but a lot of things in miniature painting, you can pay a bit extra just for that name on there. These actually came from jewellery making. My wife does a lot of jewellery making. She's very talented, and these are some I probably stole from there. So you don't need to pay vast amounts of money. A good sharp pair is really what you're after. This is a craft knife. This is very good for really, again, getting rid of some of the larger pieces of excess plastic, or sometimes where there's a really pronounced mold line, it's quite useful for that. And then I have here just a really simple, cheap file. This one is very small. You can see when I compare it to a craft knife, it is a very small file, which I find very useful for getting into some of those really small gaps on a miniature that you find. I have a bit of a selection of them, to be fair, but I think these came from Lidl or some other very cheap shop, so they're definitely not expensive at all, but they're very good for getting rid of some of that excess material. And now I'm not going to show you great detail of removing all the mold lines, because that will make for a very boring video, but I'll look at some of the miniatures and look at some more specifics of how to get rid of the mold lines. So I'm going to start off by having a look at this Reaper miniature here. It's from the Bones line, so it's the soft plastic that you get with that. And if you've seen some of my stuff on Twitter and even some of my stuff on Patreon, you'll know that I am a big fan of the bone stuff in general. One of the real frustrations, though, is with the mold lines, and you can see here this one, and I admit I've chosen this one because it is a particularly pronounced issue. This guy has a bald head, and running right through the middle of that bald head is this mold line, and it does run through the rest of the body. Let's have a look. You can kind of see some excess around here as well, and all along there and up here, and that really is one of the challenges with the Reaper Bones line, is some of the mold lines are really not in the most helpful positions. But with a little bit of work, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. What I would do here, and I would say at this point, everything I'm saying here is what I've found to work for me. Not everybody has exactly the same technique. it probably will help you in the long run to have a think about what works best for you. But I think this is a good way to get started. So because this is so pronounced, I would actually start off with the craft knife. Now, I hope it goes without saying, but obviously be careful with the craft knife. You could do yourself some damage. You could also do quite a bit of damage to the miniature. So you do want to be very careful, particularly when getting in close like this. But I think some of these bits around the edge here we can get in and do with the knife and really start to pare that down and clean off some of that excess like that. If you do find that you take off too much plastic, it is possible to then get back in and really have another go and kind of put some of the texture back in. That takes a little more practice, but with the bones things where you're only paying, well, I would pay sort of between £2 and £3 probably for a miniature like this. It's a good opportunity to try out some of those things that you wouldn't necessarily do otherwise. But I would, as I say, I won't do this whole miniature at this point, but I would make a start with that and get rid of some of the worst things like that, and then I would really get in with this small file and pick out some of those lines, and then you really want to be doing long strokes across the mould line. So the mould line is running side to side on the head, so I'm going sort of back to front here, and the long strokes help to really pick up the flashing, or the mould line should I say, without doing a great deal of damage to the model around. You do sometimes still have to be a little careful, but that really starts to pick that up. And this is why I would encourage you to wash your bones miniatures after this stage, because it can make a bit of debris and a bit of extra stuff just sitting on the mini, which it then helps to get rid of. The mould lines here are simply because the moulds that are used come in multiple parts, because it allows the moulds to be made and it allows the plastic to be injected, or the metal, we'll see later. And it's simply where the moulds don't quite completely form a tight seal, so there's a tiny bit of slippage, and that does get worse over time with a mould. So if a company's been using a mould for a very long time, the mould lines do tend to get slightly worse, but it's not too much of an issue. We can start to get rid of it. It's not perfect on the head there, but you can definitely see that it is less pronounced than it once was, which is good, and that's what we're aiming for. It can be a bit of a slow process, but eventually we get there. So that's the Reaper miniature. Next up, I will show you the metal miniature that I have here. So here we have a metal orc. This is from Scotia Grendel, which if you've seen a lot of the stuff on the Patreon, you'll know I'm a very big fan of all their scenery, but they make really good metal miniatures as well. I don't know how well that's going to focus. It's not going to do brilliantly, I think. But this is really good. It's, to my eyes, as someone who played the old Warhammer in the, I guess it was the 90s, it really has a feel of some of that stuff. But you can see here, there is a lot of extra stuff just hanging around on here. But again, pretty simple to remove. I mean, some of this metal, because it's soft, you can actually just bend it off. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as a way forward, but for very small bits you can. But here I would go for the cutters, and you simply find where there are bits which shouldn't be there, and you start snipping them off like this. You do find mould lines on metal miniatures as well. This one I think is not actually too bad, which is good. So perhaps it means it was a new mould. But what you find on here that I've never really seen on plastic miniatures, I don't know whether it is a possibility, but is these large sort of spines which hold the miniature together. Now this isn't actually part of the miniature, it's part of the casting process, but it's clearly serves a structural purpose, and when the metal is being poured into the cast, it ends up there, but we can still remove that. We don't need it when we are using it or painting it, so we can get rid of those big metal spines there. And so slowly you see the shape of the miniature starts to appear, where before it was not so obvious. Now you do sometimes get the questions of, are some of these things part of the miniature, or are they part of the moulding process? Here I'm pretty confident actually that it's part of the moulding process. But the key is it's your miniature and it's your choice. And if you want to, even if you end up finding some mould lines that you haven't taken off, I mean, that, to be honest, that happens to everybody. But you can use that, you can turn it into a scar or a piece of damage or something of that nature. And that can work really well. But I think it's a good practice to get into, to find and remove as much as you can early on in the process. Now, when you've done that, you can just about make out here, there are still some little extra bits there which shouldn't be there. That's in part because you don't want to cut too close to the miniature, because you don't want to end up chopping part of his sword off or anything. But again, we get our file out and just start working away slowly on that and just wearing it away. And pretty soon you've gone from what was a miniature covered in extra metal to one which is pretty close to painting there and just requires a little bit more work. So I'll move on to the Games Workshop ones next, and we'll see how they shape up. And as promised, here is that sprue that we saw earlier. I don't actually know where the rest of the horse is. I found this amongst some of my very old stuff, and looking at it, it's copyright in 1995, so this is a very old one, but it's fundamentally the same process. So we go back to these cutters and simply cut it away where these vents are. We cut it away from the sprue. Now, I would recommend, particularly early on, that you do leave a little bit there, certainly to begin with, just because it can be difficult to get the right angle to get them off, and it's much easier then to clean that off afterwards rather than going straight in and trying to cut it there. And then we can pare it down just using these clippers again. Let me find an angle where you can actually see it. So yeah, there we go. Clip that off, and it's virtually gone now. You can't really see a lot there at all. I'll have a quick go at that. There we are. But then again, the craft knife can come out, and we can just start to, nobody comment on the fact that I'm cutting towards my thumb, but you just start to take it off there. And the key thing here really is what you're looking for, or I suppose what you're feeling for, is a flat surface. It doesn't really matter if you can still see a little bit on the surface. You do sometimes find that the plastic fatigues slightly as you're doing this, and it changes colour a little bit, but obviously you're going to paint over it. So the actual look of it is much less important than the feel, and making sure that it's flat enough that it's not going to give you texture you don't want as you go along. Now you can see again on this, we've got quite a strong mould line there, so we'll get in with the file, and I won't do all of this because it will bore you greatly, but we just start to wear that down, and again we're looking for a nice flat surface, and you can see it doesn't take all that long on a particular area once you get started, but it's the trick almost is finding those areas that need it as much as anything else as you go along. So that's the Games Workshop one. Lastly, I will show you a resin miniature and just talk through a little bit about how that looks in comparison. And here we are with the resin miniature. This is the Monster Hunter, which is from Black Sun Miniatures, and I really like this miniature. As you can see, it's attached to a sprue, as the others have been. Because this is resin, it has a slightly different look and feel to it. One thing I would say before I do anything, or before I recommend anything, is it is suggested in a number of places that you wear breathing apparatus when you work with resin miniatures. Now, the formulation of resin is very different in different companies use different things. So not all resins are the same, and it might well be that some of them are. That's not an issue. I'm not a material scientist, and I'm not going to make pronouncements on the effect of resin or how how your lungs would react to it. I am going to pass on that information, and do be careful. And if you are looking to use resin miniatures, make sure you're taking all the requirements, all the precautions that you can. So a lot of the resin stuff is the same. So obviously you'd be clipping off the sprue. I'm not going to do this here at the moment. But what I found with a lot of the resin miniatures, which I haven't found with the others, is this really light coloured, it's almost see-through material which hangs around on the edge of the miniature. Lots of little bits and pieces, and again, you just have to be a bit careful and find those areas that need work. And again, same tools. Go at it with the craft knife very carefully. I shouldn't say go at it with a craft knife. It's probably bad advice. But just very carefully start working it away with that, and also with your file. And again, in little time at all, you'll have that to a point where you can get it glued together, get it primed, get it painted, and you'll have a beautiful miniature at that point. So that's all I'm going to talk you through today. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have any questions about the best tools to use, anything about the different types of material or how they're used, do get in touch. Let me know. Twitter, Patreon, anything like that. I'm always happy to answer any questions. So thanks for watching. Thanks for taking the time to go through all this with me. And I'll move on to the next stage of preparing the miniatures in the next video. But in the meantime, happy painting.